Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Changing the Industry Online Summit. I'm super excited for today's content, but before we dig in, I just want to thank you for being here, taking time out of your busy day. I know it's been quite a hectic year for many folks, especially with all the industry volatility. So we're going to have some candid conversations today, some insights from um, experts in the field, scholars, etc. I'll start with kind of my introduction and then we'll get things kicked off. I'll try and be quick so we can get to the meat of the content. But again, thank you all so much for joining us for this half-day online summit hosted in collaboration with the International Game Developers Association, IGDA, and the Communications Workers of America, CWA. This summit is dedicated to amplifying the voices of game developers and advocating for a stronger and more inclusive industry. And to do this effectively with sustainable impact, our industry needs to consider some serious changes in how it functions. My name is Dr. Jake Invella, and I serve as the Executive Director of the IGDA. Now, before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit more information about the organizations hosting the event, just in case it's your first time engaging. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and make the screen like full size so you get all the information. Give me just a moment while I grab my other screen. All right, so again, just a little bit about the folks running this online summit. The IGDA, of course, I hope you're familiar with the IGDA, the International Game Developers Association. The IGDA was founded in 1994 and is the world's largest nonprofit professional association serving all game creators. We have IGDA chapters and special interest groups that stretch across the globe as we are committed to supporting and empowering game developers in achieving fulfilling and sustainable careers. The IGDA provides quite a bit to its membership and the general game developer community. We provide global connections to industry professionals, access to member benefits such as discounts on events, hardware, software, etc., mentorship and career support, educational and advocacy-based initiatives such as this one, and solidarity among game workers around the world, organized under IGDA chapters and special interest groups. We have chapters in over 70 countries and special interest groups that range from discipline like engineering, design, art, as well as advocacy-based topics and affinity-based groups such as women in games, Latinx in games, Black in games. The online summit today is also co-hosted by the Communications Workers of America, CWA, a labor union representing hundreds of thousands of workers across various industries. CWA and CWA Code are actively engaged and involved in supporting the empowerment of game industry workers. CWA works with game workers to create fair and safe workplaces, and they do this in a number of ways, but ultimately they provide organizer training for those interested in unionizing their workplace. Now, a little bit about today's agenda, and I'll pop back up on screen so you can see my face again. We've got quite a bit to cover. Every other year, the IGDA has surveyed game developers to understand important trends at the developer level within the industry. Today, we'll explore some of the key findings from our most recent IGDA Developer Satisfaction Survey, which was released earlier this year. And then we'll dive into some of the most urgent and pressing issues facing game workers, including major trends, worker empowerment initiatives such as unionization, community organizing, diversity, equity, inclusion, and more. For example, just for some data that we had collected in the DSS this last time around, 4.8% of DSS respondents indicated that they were currently unemployed. The really interesting part of this data is that over half of those unemployed respondents indicated that they had been permanently laid off. This was the largest report of permanent layoffs reported in our DSS since we've been doing this survey since 2014. For those wishing to learn more about the DSS and we won't go step by step or follow along or anything like that, but for later after the summit, if you're wanting to read more about the reports, you can actually get that information right on our website at igda.org/surveys. ig.org/DSS, and we will get that put into our comments here in just a bit. Give me just a minute while I post that for y'all real quick. Wonderful. So again, we are thrilled to have you with us as we tackle some important topics with leading voices in game development and game industry advocacy. Now, after the end of the summit, please don't consider it the end of the conversation. In fact, think of it more as the start of an even larger conversation that we're having. We'll feature a handful of voices today, but we also need to acknowledge the voices that are missing from the table, and that today's discussions require more participation from game workers just like you. To kick things off, we'll begin with a look back at the industry journey with unionization, followed by a 2 p.m. panel on the state of the industry. Later at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, later at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, we'll have breakout sessions where you can join discussions on union organizing or advocacy in games. And those will be in our IGDA Discord server. And we'll provide links to that when it is time to move on from StreamYard to Discord. Thank you again for being here, for participating in this important discussion. And please share this link with others who might find insight or importance in the conversations today. Now, we'll first get started with bringing on Johanna Westar and Jamie Woodcock, scholars who can shed a little bit more light on the historical and social context of some of the pressing matters that we're facing as the games industry. So be right back as we bring Jamie and Johanna on. Let's see. Perfect. And I will actually pop off and let y'all take the lead. Johanna, you'll see yourself here in just a second once my face is gone. All right. Thanks so much for being here, and we look forward to the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Jacob. And I'm supposed to be in charge of the tech, but I don't know if I'm the right choice. But there, I see it coming now. So hopefully we'll get that in full screen for you. Does that look okay to you, Jamie?
It's not coming up full screen as of yet.
Don't know how to make it go full screen in the slide sharing space.
Sorry, I will. Oh, no worries. I'll try and pull that up from, I think you said you emailed me. Sorry
Yes.
for the delay, folks. We're just going to push through this technical matter, and it should be taken care of in just a minute. So just hang tight. Because, you know, it can't be an online conference without a little tech hiccup here and there, right?
And we can probably just start the preamble maybe as we're getting that going for sure. So thanks so much for having us, Jakin, and all of those of you at the CWA. Jamie and I are excited to be here. We've just actually spent a week together talking all about game workers and game worker organizing. So we're well primed. What we are hoping to present to you over the next 40 minutes or so is just some highlights from the 2023 IGDA Developer Satisfaction Survey, which I have worked with the IGDA in collaboration on that project since a while now. And I'll give you some highlights of that, and then we'll segue over to Jamie, who will kind of put some of the in the weeds data into some context with the broader political economy of the game industry, and then move into some discussions around the unionization project worldwide. So that's where we're headed. We will just a little bit of background on the IGDA survey, and Jakin gave you a little bit of a teaser, and I've got the website there for you as well. It's been conducted 7 times now since 2014. And it's really a very useful benchmarking instrument that focuses a lot on working conditions. So there are a lot of groups that survey the game industry. Much of the time that's coming from trade associations or industry associations that are really looking to boost the industry in terms of government support and things like that. And that data is all very good, but sometimes it doesn't focus on the nuts and bolts of what's happening with actual game workers. And the DSS really tries to focus on that space. And it's open to anyone in the broader game industry in a professional or even an academic capacity. There are lots of different branching pathways that you can take when you participate in the survey. There it is. Thank you so much, Jakin. We've been doing the survey at different time intervals, but our hope is to run the next one in 2026. And the survey really does support the IGDA specifically in terms of advocacy efforts and setting different organizational priorities. But it's also been a very, very important source of information for the game community, the game press, and the broader public about the context of what's going on in games. So just to move to the next slide, and we can get into some of the key elements. The survey itself covers a lot of different themes, and for anyone who has taken it, it's not a 10-minute survey, so we do appreciate everyone's attention when you engage with it. But we cover a lot of important themes, like demographic scopes, like questions around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and also a lot of questions that help us map the industry characteristics, also characteristics around people's different employment experiences, quite a few questions around compensation and benefits, definitely questions around working time, and also some questions around employment relations that include unionization. And what we're able to do in the survey and in the data is really cut the data in a lot of different ways, because of course this industry is incredibly diverse. And we have lots of people engaging with the industry in many different employment contract formats and lots of different ways to work and support in the industry. And so we often break out the data into various profiles. And some really important profiles are looking at employees versus contractors or freelancers versus the self-employed, because those three groups have very different experiences. And then often able to pull things out. Questions that we have just for students, and then also features by identity groups or studio size or region, as those are important things too. So who answered the survey? In the latest round in 2023, there were just under 800 people answered the survey. And we could just pop on to the next slide there. And for the most part, the demographics are not going to be surprising to folks. Most of the people who take the survey are working in the United States. And so that's about 47% of the survey. And that's something that we are actively working on to try to get a more global and international reach. Jake, and if you can just pop it onto the next slide, that would be super. Thanks. And then the next greatest population is in Canada, and that just might be a feature of me being in here and flogging my networks. But game developers do tend to be younger than the average population. We see folks, the average age of the people who answered the survey is 35. This is a highly educated group, so 80% of the respondents had tertiary level education, so a degree or a diploma from a college or university. The industry is still quite white, if this survey is any generalization. And we do have to there keep in mind that we're surveying mostly the North American population. So that's going to skew the data a little bit here. But we see that 79% of the sample identifies as white in some way. 63% of the sample identified as male identifying or identifying as a man, though we do note that 8% of respondents identified with as a gender non-binary, and that is a higher statistic than you would see in the average labor force populations. Similarly, we see 72% of the respondents identifying as straight, but again, that reflects a much higher proportion of individuals who are identifying with the LGBTQ plus community than also in the regular population. So we see some diversity in those areas in particular. It's highly notable that not very many people in the survey, and maybe in games broadly, have children. So we are talking about a group that doesn't have a lot of dependent responsibilities, and that becomes important when we think about working conditions. And 44% identified as having a physical or mental difference, and a large proportion of that group does identify having a neurodivergence. And so that's an important statistic as well. So we see, and I'm just giving you some snapshots because there's too much data to report on in a lot of detail, but you can see that this information around company size reflects a polarization of the industry. So we have employees working kind of across the spectrum of small, medium, large workplaces, but freelancers tend to be in much smaller places, and the self-employed tend to be concentrated in very small or small organizations or studios. And we have a real hollowing out of the middle, and Jamie might cover that a little bit later in terms of mergers and acquisitions that often happen to that kind of potentially successful middle group. In terms of employment security, this is still a major concern and issue in the industry. We see that even among employees, which you would think to be the more stable group, 53% of this sample had less than 10 years of experience in the industry. And in the past 5 years, 53% of them had 2 or more employers. So moving around a lot. 30% of them expect to remain with their current employer for only 1 to 3 years, and a little bit more than that for 4 to 6 years. So really an expectation of mobility, and 17% of them don't know how long that they will remain in the industry at all. You can see the information there for freelancers and contractors as well. And what I wanted to highlight here that I find really interesting and problematic is that the contractors and freelancers have almost a similar profile in terms of the number of clients that they've had over the 5-year period that we asked them about, which shows us that employers are actually misclassifying or misusing workers a lot and hiring them on freelance or contract when they actually are serving roles that are very similar to what full-time employees would be serving, and that is a challenge in the industry. In terms of working hours, if we go to the next slide, long hours are still an issue, and some of those graphs might be a little bit small on your screen, but you can get them, they're all from the report, so you can get them all there. But we do see that a high proportion of people are still working in crunch or something that they would consider long hours, but maybe not, crunch per se. And we see that a very high proportion of people, so the purple bar in the middle graph there, are people that have been engaged in crunch more than twice over the past 2 years. And so that's really a dominant chunk of the sample across all 3 of those employee, freelance, and self-employed groups. And we also see that crunch is considered an expected part of the job for most of these workers, especially the freelancer group, which is that big blue bar in the third graph. So long hours is still there, even though over the course of studying this industry, it has improved. And if we look at the next slide, we see that the hours of crunch are still quite extreme for many people. So regular hours of work are coalescing more in, and we'll have some different North American and European, et cetera, norms here, but in North America, a 40-hour work week tends to be normal or standard. And we see that occurring for most employees. We see that freelancers are a little bit more varied in their working hours, and the self-employed also. But when we look at the crunch hours, we see that a lot of people are working over 50 hours, over 60 hours, and even still some people working over 70 and over 80 hours when they are working in those crunch periods. And that seems to be worse actually for freelancers and the employee group when you look at some of those hourly breakdowns. And if we go to the heart of the matter on the next slide, there, for most people working in games, these extreme hours are still largely unpaid. And so in the survey data, we see that 49% of freelancers said that overtime isn't even applicable to them at all. And another 35% that they don't negotiate it into their contracts. So that's a very large group of people getting zero extra pay for this work. And if we look at employees who we might expect to have overtime pay more often, only 14% of the respondents receive overtime pay. The rest, some of them get time off in the future, some of them get snacks, which is not an appropriate compensation, and 32% of them get absolutely nothing. So this remains a real industry problem. And then just quickly on a few other pieces that people are often interested in, we do ask salary data of the respondents in the DSS. And what I'm showing you here is 3 different graphs. Again, the one with sort of this red U curve is for the self-employed. And then the top one is for the employees, and the bottom one on the right is for freelancers. And we can see actually quite distinct salary shapes for those different groups without even kind of getting in the weeds of it. That we see for the self-employed, we see a lot of people who are making very, very little. And that top bar is folks who are making under $15,000 a year. This is all in US dollars. Whereas the bottom one, graph there or bar is for people making over $150,000. So a real polarization is happening with folks who are classified as self-employed. Whereas for the employees, we see a little bit less of a concentration at the lower ends of the salary scale at the top there, and more people at the higher salary brackets, with some real clustering there in the middle range. Whereas for freelancers, we see quite a bit of concentration at the low end of the spectrum and less so at the top end of the spectrum. So just even visually, those graphs tell a fairly compelling story about what's going on out there in the industry. A couple other interesting facts just around freelancers. They come to the industry in a lot of different ways. Surprisingly, maybe, is that 28% of this sample were saying that they were hired as freelancers or contractors right out of school. And I think that should be troubling for us because that's a very precarious kind of work to be engaging in right after you've graduated. And it may reflect just an increasing norm of moving towards that kind of work as opposed to full-time work. We also see for the self-employed in the lower graph there that 59% of the sample of self-employed workers are self-funding their games. So this is also a very precarious place and getting into the industry kind of in a very hook or by crook kind of way for many of these self-employed workers. On the important question of equity, diversity, and inclusion, this remains a challenge for the game industry, definitely. And just on the next slide that Jacon's going to put up for us here, we see that we ask a lot of questions about whether people's studios or companies have programs and policies to help or support EDI initiatives. And in terms of programs, we're talking about things like efforts to retain diverse talent or to recruit from more diverse applicant pools. So do you have a program to help find and locate more diverse applicant pools? And on the policy side, we're talking about things like non-discrimination or anti-harassment policies in your workplace, or maybe equal opportunity hiring policies. And we can see that 28% of the respondents say that no, their company doesn't have any of these programs. 38% have no idea which probably means no. And then when we get to the policies, 11% their companies don't have any of these policies, and 20% don't know. And a very high number of respondents say that there is not equal treatment for all in the game industry. 67% say no. And when we ask questions about experiences of inequity, over half the sample has say that they've never experienced inequity. So we're looking at like 46% of people say that they have experienced inequity themselves. And 39% say that they've never witnessed inequity towards others, which means we're looking at about 70% of people, 60-70% of people who have witnessed inequity in their environment. Those are very, very high and disturbing numbers. So setting Jamie up here now, we have a number of questions about employment relations and unionization, and we've had those on the survey for the last number of years. And we really like this question. It asks about the effectiveness of systems that your company might have for resolving problems at work. And we ask people about resolving individual problems, and we ask about resolving group problems. And what we see here is the green bar on both of those, individuals is on the left and groups is on the right. There's a sense that they're somewhat effective, but not overwhelmingly so. And then if you add up the numbers of those who say that they're not too effective and not effective at all, we're really not seeing a very good landscape of robust HR or employment relations systems. And that does then lead us to questions around unionization and how to better improve some of those systems and get a better voice in terms of working conditions. And so the last slide before I turn it over to Jamie is just to look at some of the views around unionization. We've only asked the question, are you in a union, since 2019, because before then it wasn't as applicable, but now it's a very exciting question. And we see that the numbers are increasing, and 13% in 2023 is probably now outdated. But what's interesting here is that we see a lot of support for things like a national union. That's the kind of union actually that gets the most positive support from folks that are answering the DSS, which is really interesting in terms of the wide-ranging solidarity that workers do want to see across the industry. And I'll turn it over to Jamie for on that.
Thank you so much, Johanna. And before we swap over to Jamie for Jamie's side of the presentation, we did have a question I wanted to see if we could relay to you. And I think it was going back to some of the slides regarding salary, but I'll put the question up. That's from Jason Schmidt. Might have said this, but is this focused on companies developing games specifically? How much of the boundary businesses, like service providers whose services can be applied to other industries, but they have a specialization working with game companies as well, i.e. ad devs, social media management, cloud architecture, etc. Yeah, if you had any insight on that, that would be awesome.
Yeah, it's a great and very important question, Jason, because the industry is, of course, so diverse and these different spaces operate quite differently. So the DSS itself is open to everyone. It's very, very broad. And we then kind of tailor the questions that people receive as they identify themselves in different ways through questions. So the majority of the people answering the survey are working in what you would consider kind of typical game creation roles in game studios. But we do have a handful of folks working in a sort of external services and support services. And we do have people working in things like esports, in event management. We have academics who are engaged in making games as part of their work. For the most part, the data that I showed you today is data from people who are working directly in games. And so that would include the broader kind of wraparound industries, but not game journalists or academics or anything like that. And if we get more of those people answering the survey, we can slice the data out more and more specifically.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Johanna. Really appreciate that segment and for all you do for the DSS. And then, yeah, I'll pass the mic over to Jamie.
Lovely, thank you very much. And yeah, I just want to say thank you to Johanna for presenting the stats, because I think anyone trying to do research in the industry, this is a really valuable tool. Yeah, we'll start on that slide. So I'm going to give a whistle-stop tour of the political economy of games. There is a lot we can say about the political economy of games. In particular, I'm interested in studying games because I think they tell us something about how work and production are changing globally in quite profound ways. And so when I say political economy, what I mean by is thinking about how the industry is structured, not only by companies, but also by the state, by power relations, by international networks. And I'm going to talk particularly, as Johanna has, about the production of the software part of games. But I just want to, as a bit of a note, say that we should also think about the broader supply chains that are necessary for us to play games, right? To think about the mining that's required, the manufacturing of hardware, the underlying internet infrastructure that, of course, CWA has been active organizing workers around those parts of the industry too. But also thinking about how the game studios may also rely on outsourcing in different ways. International networks of production, also quality assurance, outsourcing this to other companies, and then also the kinds of ways that not only with crunch, but that labor can be a part of some of these relationships in other kinds of unpaid ways. And so I think it's important when we talk about the games industry to be clear what we're talking about when we say the games industry. And for this, we're going to talk about the production of software and games. Next slide, please. And within this, and I think this comes out in the presentation that Joanna has started with, but there are broadly two kinds of companies that are making games in this way. We can think about the big AAA companies, mid to large sized organizations. You may have 1,000+ people working on a game, large studios, maybe split across a number of places. And then at the smaller end, independent studios, independent in the sense of being independent from larger organizations, and perhaps using other methods to finance their games, not being paid by a publisher. And hopefully not all self-financing from their own pocket, as comes out a little bit in the survey. And often people talk about the games industry as being pulled between these two kinds of models. But the distinction can be a lot more complicated in practice. Indie games has a kind of cultural attachment as well of being, an upstart in the industry and doing things differently. And I think at some point, running a competition to find the biggest indie, we'd find some quite large ones in the industry, I think. Next slide, please. And in part, this is about the saturation of the market in terms of how many games are being made. Looking at Steam, and I, would be very worried to look at how many unplayed games I have in my Steam account. But if we look at the number of games that are being released just on one platform, so this doesn't capture all games, we can see that from 2014 onward, the number of games that are being released on Steam begins to pick up significantly. So the length of the IGDA survey, getting to an estimated 15,000 games released in 2024, but 14,000 released last year. So we're talking about a huge number of games that are being produced. That means the competition for making money out of games becomes even sharper. Next slide, please. As an example, if you go onto Steam today, this is not my unplayed list. This is the total number of games. It's almost 200,000 games. And then think about some of the other distribution platforms on consoles and different ways of accessing games on mobile and so on. Is we're talking about an area of cultural production that is really, really vast. I hope there are not too many games on there that have never been played, but we could imagine that just putting money into producing a game isn't necessarily going to mean a big return on investment for smaller and medium-sized organizations. Next slide, please. And this is one of the dynamics that I want to talk about in my whistle-stop tour, because I think there's a couple of things that define the games industry in the kind of current period. And one of them is asking about who owns games and who owns game production. And at the moment, internationally, the games industry is dominated by three large companies: Sony Interactive Entertainment, Tencent Interactive Entertainment, and Microsoft Gaming. And in terms of revenue in US dollars from the last year, these three are way above competitors. The next biggest is Nintendo with half the revenue, NetEase Games, and Electronic Arts. And there are only 59 companies with a revenue of over 100 million. And really, it's this top end. There is a big centralization of capital. Valve, the owner of Steam, isn't a publicly tradable company, so it doesn't report in quite the same way about its revenue. I'd imagine that Valve is quite a large company. But really what we've seen over this period is this centralization within an increasingly smaller number of firms within the games industry. Next slide, please. And we can see this over the past couple of years with a marked increase in acquisitions. I've put the top 5 acquisitions of the last couple of years in terms of how much was paid for the acquisitions there. And we can see very, very large purchases. Microsoft's purchase of Activision Blizzard, Take-Two buying Zynga, but also Saudi and Swedish investment firms buying into the games industry at multi-billion billion-dollar acquisitions. And also sprees of purchasing. I mean, Tencent owns stakes in a whole number of different companies now. The Embracer Group bought up a very, very large number of smaller studios. And so in part, when Johanna was talking about that shift, that polarization in the industry, we can see a lot of medium-sized firms being bought up and being brought in-house with these larger firms, which pulls apart financing in the industry, essentially. And part of this is about trying to monopolize. So companies that are also platform owners, in a sense, buying up companies to try and keep them only on their platform. And this can have an effect on the experience of work for many game workers. I sometimes tell this story of British companies being bought by American companies, and it's not only the difference in working hours that was mentioned by Johanna. There are also different kinds of management practices and so on that people can be quite worried about other firms buying up their company and what that might mean for their working patterns and working conditions. Next slide, please. And in part, this has also resulted, in part, the acquisitions we can say have resulted in a round of layoffs. This is not uncommon in other industries, that when large periods of acquisitions happen, then companies decide to lay off staff because they've bought particular parts of the studio or IP or whatever it might be. But I think, and I imagine this will come out in some of the sessions later today, but 2023-24 has really been marked by high numbers of layoffs in the games industry. An estimate of 10,000 in the previous year, as many as 1,300 this year. And this, along with the point I'm going to make on the next slide, increases the labor market saturation. And what I mean by this is the number of people who want to work in games. There are some industries where people really want to work in that industry, will study, will maybe use their own money or financing to get into the industry. And layoffs make that even harder, because then you have people, a larger pool of people competing for a smaller pool of jobs. Next slide, please. And another kind of feature of this is universities have long had a relationship with the games industry. Having people from universities go on to form companies, supplying labor to games companies. There are lots of clusters of game production near universities that are training graduates. But game courses have become increasingly popular. For example, in Britain, not the largest country in the world, offers 470 courses across 135 higher education providers, mostly universities. But there's been a huge growth of games courses. One that I put up on here from the College of Esports to train people to work in the esports industry. There are now a whole number of these university courses. There are not that many people who work in esports in Britain. And there are some estimates, in some parts of Europe or other countries, that there might be 4 times the number of graduates being trained each year than work in the industry. So we can see a huge number of people entering into the industry, perhaps because lots of other jobs available to us at the moment aren't as exciting as games and people want to do something they enjoy, but we can see this kind of overproduction of graduates. Next slide, please. But in the last part of my presentation, before we open up for some questions, I want to kind of bring this into the story of unionization. And as Johanna said, the current wave of unionization has really begun in 2018. There had been some more isolated incidents that you can see on this bar chart going back in time. Some incidents in the 2000s, protests around crunch in the 90s and in the 80s, particularly unionized workers in factories making consoles who are active in the labor movement in different ways. Next slide, please. But what we've seen is a real spike in collective actions from 2018 onwards, the start of Game Workers Unite, a kind of international movement for unionization. And with a game worker in Britain, Austin Kelmore, who's part of the IWGB Game Workers branch, we've been trying to map collective actions in the games industry. And we have 179 or so listed so far. You can go and have a look at the data yourself. It's all available on the website. And I want to try and pick out a couple of lessons from it before finishing up. Next slide, please. So what's happened so far, and I've picked out particularly here instances of union-related activity, because not all collective action is union-related. Open letters or non-union protests, these sorts of things, is we can see a real clustering of where unionization is taking place. North America, Europe, and then South Korea and Australia. These are the main areas where things have happened so far. Next slide, please. But imagining that perhaps we have a North American audience, or at least some North Americans in the audience, we can see a real clustering of activities that are happening in North America at the moment. And in part, this is about the industrial relations model in the US and in Canada, that in Britain, there is a single event that happened for unionization. A union was formed. Whereas in North America, studio by studio, workers have to decide to vote to become members of the union. And so we get this really interesting picture of where people are beginning to unionize. And it's often, and I'm sure other CWA people can talk more to this, but quality assurance workers, some of those at the lower end of that U scale that Joanna showed, of people who are organizing around paying conditions and these kinds of questions in a much more immediate sense. Next slide, please. And I think what we see overall is a really interesting, for us as academics, a really interesting case study of what happens when internationally workers in a sector decide that they want to try and unionize, but then have to go back into a national context to figure out what unionization means. And I say interesting for us as academics because usually it doesn't happen this way. Usually people unionize in one place, it spreads somewhere else. You get this kind of patchwork pattern. Whereas here we have lots of game workers simultaneously trying out different routes to unionization. And this is shaped by two things predominantly so far. The first is the industrial relations system. How can you unionize? What does unionization involve? Are you free to join any union? Does the state set requirements about the kinds of unions that people join? And then also about the choice of what unions that people decide to join. You know, are they joining unions like CWA that have a history in the sector, perhaps, or related sectors that, you know, involve people from the games industry and the organizing there? Are they setting up wholly new unions? Are they joining alternative unions? And I think the story so far, and I think perhaps this is what's more interesting to game workers, is that this can provide examples of what's effective and what works, because nobody knows what will work best to unionize the games industry than game workers themselves, right? People who work in the industry, who feel these grievances and concerns most closely. And I think what we're beginning to see is examples of where successes can happen, and that unionization isn't something alien to the games industry. It's perfectly possible for people to organize. Yes, around issues like pay and conditions, but also around issues of control. What kinds of games are people making? Under what kinds of conditions do they make them in? How to deal with questions around equity in a much more engaging way than might have been possible before, and trying to reshape the industry. And I think that's, you know, incredibly exciting. But conscious that we want to hear from some of you in the audience. If you have questions or comments, it would be really great to hear from you.
Thank you both so much, Dr. Jamie Woodcock, Dr. Johanna Westar. Really appreciate that awesome overview. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat and we will get those on screen. And I will actually go ahead and get started with one of them. So one of the things that really struck a chord in me is when you were talking about the market saturation. Of course, we know that many folks are trying to get into games, but also the contrast of lots of educational programs and lots of opportunities to get into games that people might find very appealing, especially if they glamorize the industry and the profession. So I guess my question to both of you, and I imagine y'all might have different takes on this, but as a student coming out of a program, whether that's a traditional higher education program where you get a full degree or certificate, or if it's, you know, more of a boot camp program where you're really just learning some strong technical skills to jump into looking for a job, what advice or guidance might you have? And you can be as candid as you wish. This, I mean, we all know the dire conditions of the industry. So I think folks who are in that position need to hear a candid response. So yeah, Johanna, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks, Jakin. It's a shameless self-promotion, but I'm working with some other great academics right now on a project to kind of figure this out a little bit better, because I think we haven't had a lot of attention on this question and there's a lot more to learn. And so we've been interviewing people in their final year of a game development program, and then interviewing them every year for 3 years afterwards, to just sort of see what those pathways look like. And to be candid, for many of them, they're terrible. And you know, our study will have the unique feature of happening right during this massive moment of layoffs, and so that will always be a little star in what we looked at. But what we're learning the most, and I don't know that this is something that game programs would want to hear, but the students who are the most successful, they seem to be building that success through their own efforts and not necessarily through things that their program set up for them or that their program taught them specifically. So a lot of the networking, a lot of the building your portfolio, a lot of the chasing down an internship, which does seem to be helpful if you can get those in your final year or just out of school. Students are doing that work themselves. They're forming communities themselves. They're forming alumni networks largely themselves, and those things are all helping. But it's very disheartening for a lot of students who don't have the time or energy or money or ability to do a lot of that extracurricular work, that they are the ones losing out in that equation.
No, thank you so much for that insight. And yeah, like you said, for students who don't quite have that opportunity or that flexibility in their schedule or the money to take away from work to focus on those extracurriculars, I imagine the impact can be pretty detrimental. So thanks for the candid response on that one. And then Jamie, if you wanted to respond to the same question, but we also have a few other questions that we can get to as well. So up to you.
I mean, I guess just very, very quickly, I mean, the games industry isn't the only industry with an overproduction of students. The university also does this. There are many more grad students every year than there are academic jobs. And I guess I would say, like, I think you should go to study whatever you want at university, because it's a brief moment where you don't have to worry about work, although most of my students work now. But it's very difficult to say that with how much university education costs. And so, I'm always torn on this of saying, go and study whatever you're passionate about, but then realizing how much debt students get into. And I think, the other part to this solution is, speak to workers who are unionizing in your country and hear from them about the experiences and the routes they've taken. These unions can also be a community, right? A community where people can reach out to people.
Absolutely. And along with the community, kind of self-plugging the IGDA, because to Johanna's point, the networks that you build as a student can become the most important or one of the most important aspects for landing an opportunity. Get involved with game developer communities, whether that's IGDA or other game developer communities out there. There are so many, and to support your place in the industry. And then we have a few other questions I'd love to get to. So thank you, Jamie, for going into more on that last one. This one is from Stephen. Do you think that Microsoft recognizing unions like Bethesda or the Warcraft teams will lead to an increase in unionization efforts? This one's a very interesting one, especially considering the neutrality agreement with that Microsoft has with their union. So do either of you want to take it?
Go ahead, Jamie. I went first last time.
So I think this is a really interesting question. And, I'm sure there will be CWA speakers who can talk a bit more to some of the issues here. But one of the things that I think this provides is a very important example of mainstream studios unionizing that everybody in the industry knows and that people outside the industry know. And I think, will it lead to an increase in unionization efforts? I think it provides a positive, practical example that it can be done. And there's nothing like a success to encourage more organizing, right? So that would be my take on the question.
Great.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly.
Wonderful. Then similarly, we have folks who say, I wish a union, or potentially if a union was as easy as filling out a form, they feel like everyone would do it. I think the issue is either no one knows how to get this thing started or everyone's too scared to be the one to take the plunge first. I think that's also a really interesting take, considering navigating that political economy and also just the politics of a workplace. Johanna, Jamie, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, it would not be right to say that this is not without risk. It's important to know that employers, for the large part, treat unions as a hostile entity, especially at the beginning. Maybe once they have a union in their workplace for a while and they get to know it and they work with the workers on that basis, it's not as dramatic as they might have seemed. So that's where I think some of that neutrality stuff does help, because it does change the normative space around how catastrophic it might be to have a union. But for sure, it's a big thing for a worker, right? To kind of put themselves out on the line, to put themselves out there and maybe be seen as the person or the group of people who are organizing this space. And that's where really the community is very, very important as well. And most unions, and I think the way the game industry has been unionizing so far, is that there have been a lot of supportive communities that have come together and then moving into kind of the unionization effort proper after that. And that is important because it allows workers to move at the speed that is comfortable for them. And often that relates a lot to how many people you have with you. And building, the more people you have with you, the harder it is for your employer to retaliate wholeheartedly. And so taking the time to do that building, it might feel like you're going very slowly, but that is an important part of the process, particularly in the North American context, the way unionization has to happen.
Amazing. Thank you, Joanna. And we have a few more questions, but not so much more time. So I will highlight, let's see, we've got one from Jason already. So Jason, I'm so sorry. I will definitely pass along the question afterwards to the team. And looks like I saw one. There we go. Oh, I guess, I'm sorry, it's actually the same individual. So does unionization have major impacts on the mechanism to prevent layoffs? Actually, this one will probably be discussed a little bit more in the panel, but I will interject here and say we will have a union representative from CWA to facilitate, a organizer training today at 3 p.m. Central Time. So that's just in one more hour after the following panel. And that will be held in our IGDA Discord server. We'll have breakout sessions, so that will be one of the breakout sessions. The other one will be advocacy in games to discuss some advocacy work with others folks. But yeah, so due to time, I just wanted to give you maybe 1 or 2 more minutes for any last words or kind of overview that you'd like to provide to the audience today.
I guess I'll just say one thing very quickly, which is, we come from unionized workplaces. The university I work in has been unionized for a very long time. And I guess one of the lessons always with these things is every industry is unique. Just speaking a little bit to the question around fear, like every industry is unique. That's, why they're different industries. And labor history is littered with examples of places that became much fairer, better organized, unionized workplaces. And we forget that once they weren't, and people were terrified to start organizing in manufacturing work or on the docks or other places. And so sometimes I think it's good to look at history and remember that, in 10 years' time, we may look back on the games industry in a different way, right?
Great.
Yeah, and I would just say, the community is so important, and events like this, wouldn't have happened 5 years ago, definitely wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, not in this way. So, groups like the IGDA, though you're not a union yourself, there are lots of facilitator groups out there and ways to come together and start having these conversations. And you just kind of start learning, and then you build your skills and see where that goes. And so all of these kinds of interventions, I think, really help in that direction, right? To just making work better in all sorts of different ways. And many people play a role in that.
Dr. Woodcock, Dr. Westar, thank you so much for your time today, your insights. And we will send you some follow-up questions because we had a few questions that came in at the end that were really good. So if you have any thoughts that you want to share with them, we can send them along to our overview page after the event. But really appreciate your time today. And everyone watching, please stay tuned. We'll be right back in just a few minutes for our next panel to talk a little bit more about the state of the industry, where we will actually have 2 union representatives, one from Sega and one from ZeniMax. So stay tuned. We will be right back with some more discussion and candid conversation about the state of the industry. Thanks so much, everyone. All right, all right. Hello again, everyone. Good time zone to you all, and thank you so much for tuning in. We just had Dr. Johanna Westar and Dr. Jamie Woodcock present a little bit more of the societal and historical context impacting today's climate of our games industry. Now I'm excited to welcome today's panel on shaping a sustainable future for game developers. And I'll bring everyone up on the screen here in just a moment. But essentially, we're really here to discuss some of the most critical topics facing the industry: mass layoffs, industry instability, diversity, equity, and inclusion, worker empowerment initiatives, and more. I know that's a whole lot of topic for 1 hour, so we probably won't be able to hit everything, but we will try. But I want to also say that today's not necessarily just about reflecting on these issues. It really is discussing insight into how we can move forward in our industry. There's been a lot of discouragement, rightfully so. And so I want today's conversation to shape a hopeful future, a way forward, a way through this mess that we find ourselves in. Game development is often seen as a labor of passion, creativity, and innovation. Yet, too often, the people behind our favorite games face immense instability in their jobs, whether that's from crunch, layoff, burnout, the growing uncertainty caused by industry consolidation, merger and acquisitions. It's clear to us that change is necessary to protect the mental health and the livelihoods of those who fuel this industry. I'm Dr. Jake Vela. I'm the Executive Director of the International Game Developers Association, the IGDA. In case you're not familiar with the IGDA, we are the largest nonprofit professional association that serves all game creators around the world. We have IGDA chapters and special interest groups in over 70 countries, and we do everything we can to support and empower game developers in achieving a fulfilling and sustainable career. Now, let's introduce briefly some of our panelists today as I get them all up on stage. Give me just a moment. All right. Wonderful. I think that is everyone. So again, our goal today is to have a candid, forward-looking conversation that goes beyond recognizing the problems and dives a little bit deeper into real change and what that can look like. We have with us a diverse panel of voices. We have the executive director from Take This, a nonprofit leading mental health advocacy in games, the director of operations and events from the IGDA, the largest nonprofit professional association for game developers, and game workers and union members from CWA Sega and CWA ZeniMax, who are at the forefront of worker rights and advocating for better working conditions. Now, let's take a moment to have you all introduce yourselves. Thank you so much for being here. Parker, I will pass it over to you.
Should have known you'd pass it over to me. Hi, everybody. My name is Parker Wallace. My pronouns are they, them. And as Jacob said, I'm the director of events and programming operations, take your pick on all of it, with the International Game Developers Association. So if you ever connect with any of our social channels, almost any inbox, it's probably me responding to you. And so I've had the pleasure of diving into this topic quite a bit in a lot of our content and whatnot over the last number of months. So pass it over to Eve. I'm assuming I can
Perfect.
Yes,
popcorn it. Absolutely.
Thanks, Parker. My name is Eve Crevochet. For the past 6.5 years, I've been the executive director of Take This, which is a mental health organization providing advocacy, research, and training and support to people who make and play games around mental health. And tomorrow is my last day. I'm the outgoing executive director. So I am very pleased to be passing the torch on to Dr. Kelly Dunlap, who has led the mental health SIG at IGDA for many years and is a fantastic member of our team. And I'm really pleased to be here today to kind of have this one last conversation about such an important topic. And I will popcorn it over to M.
Hi, I'm M. Geiger. I'm an editor at Sega of America, and I've been working at the company since 2018. I was also a lead organizer in our union efforts and got the chance to be on the bargaining team. And I'm really happy to be here and to chat, to have a talk.
Thank you. And we're excited to have you. And then Autumn.
Hi, my name is Autumn Mitchell. I'm a senior quality assurance tester at ZeniMax. I was a part of the organizing effort with the rest of my coworkers back in 2022, and we won our union in 2023. And in spring of 2023, I was elected to be a part of the negotiations for my union, and we are still in contract negotiations for our first collective bargaining agreement with Microsoft and ZeniMax.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We have quite a diverse perspectives here on the panel, so I'm really looking forward to just engaging in some candid conversation. I know, I typically provide like guiding questions, but sometimes I like to let things just go where they naturally go. But I guess to really just kick things off, something that's on most people's minds right now, it's sort of the elephant in the room. Well, actually, there's like quite a few elephants in the room. This is like one of the elephants in the room, and it's the consistent layoffs, the mass layoffs, the instability, the concerns regarding job security, etc. And so I guess I would love to just hear a little bit more about what your thoughts are on that. Where are you with the instability and precarious nature of the industry?
I'm happy to jump in if anyone.
Yeah, take it away.
Right. Okay. So, gosh, yeah, this one, I feel like I've been writing about layoffs and the cyclical nature of the industry and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the entire time that I have been at Take This. And, we make individual games, and the production cycle is one of ramping up and then ramping down. And so there's some intrinsic instability built into the way the games are made. That is not to say that we have to then hire people and lay them off, right? That's not actually the way that all studios have to work or all companies have to work. And so when I think about some of the intrinsic structural issues in games, I think a lot about capitalism, and I think a lot about the funding models we have for games. So we have models for games and we have funding models for games and for studios that infuse a ton of capital and expect huge returns and really large amounts of success, and then cliffs if that doesn't happen, or when the game production process is over. And that is a way to, using that funding model is a way to bake in instability and make it, and kind of reinforce and enlarge the potential for that kind of problem. And so I think you have a combination of a lot of publicly traded companies now on the scene, consolidating game studios and the industry overall. You have funding models that are expecting, like investment models that are expecting huge returns. And you have an industry that really was willing to fool itself during the pandemic around what the expansion trajectory of the industry was and was going to look like in the future, because it looked good on paper for investors, right? And so you compound all of those, and you compound a relatively young industry with not a lot of sophistication around how new studios are set up and supported and encouraged to grow responsibly and carefully. And I think you get what we have right now in the industry. Yeah. I could be reductive and be like, oh, capitalism sucks, but I think there's like some very specific, which it does, but like there's some very specific levers that I think got pushed here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I'm really happy to hear and see you point out the systemic issues, but also I feel like what you're really pointing to is just a lack of sustainable structures. And I'll kind of pivot real quick over to Parker to kind of continue with that macro level perspective. Parker, based on your connections with various studios and your role at IGDA, I'd love to learn, even if it's just in a particular regional context, what can studio leaders do to kind of get away from the models that Eve was just talking about and really implement sustainable measures that won't have the push and pull, the expansion contraction at such impactful levels?
Yeah, there's a couple of things with this that I think studio leads can be looking at, especially, and you have to keep in mind, my focus is primarily on indie studios. So that is where every comment I have is going to be targeted, just so you know. But with a lot of this, there's a couple of things. One of them is leveraging the community. The community of game developers is wide and vast and broad, and there are so many people who have started their own studio, who have started to go through the stumbling blocks of creating the structure, creating the frameworks, and therefore are really the best case, like the best sources of resources really to anybody looking to start a new studio or has recently started a studio. Even though we are living in kind of a different world now post lockdowns, I don't say post pandemic, I say post lockdowns because we're still dealing with a lot of everything with that. But the world changed in a lot of ways, so it's really interesting to navigate that. But it's really leaning on that community and leaning on individuals. And if you don't know where to find that community, I mean, not to pitch IGDA, but also it's kind of what we're here for. But it's working with each other to find that, so that way you can start to figure out, okay, this hasn't worked for you. This didn't work either. Let's try this, because it's the whole thing of definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. That saying, as true or as false as it may be, it's still kind of, you won't find something new by doing the same thing over and over again. So it's challenging that. It's being inventive, taking initiative, which is something indie studios are very, very good at. They have to break the mold. They can't follow the pathway of the AAAs or anything like that. So they have to do something innovative and different, and it's embracing that innovation through your community and really leveraging that in order to build something sustainable, to find a system that works, to diversify your revenue streams. Because that's the other thing too, is that if you only have revenue streams coming in from sales, that is not going to work out in any great picture of anything. It might help fund the next one, but there's a lot more to be considered with that. So anyway, that's
great. No, thank you. That's great. It made me actually consider some conversations I have recently had with folks in the industry, particularly one, I won't name names, but they were kind of sharing of how like dangerous it really is to put your eggs all in one basket, so to speak. And the model that they were using to really manage their team, to kind of constantly have these various projects or various aspects of projects in addition to their own game, of course, like diversifying the revenue stream just in that regard, but then also just other ways of bringing in revenue. I think that's super interesting. I've also talked with folks about like cooperatives. So, employee-owned initiatives, employee-owned companies, and that also brought some interesting conversation points. But that leads me to the question of kind of going to the developer level. And Autumn and Em, I'd love your input here. At the developer level, what can game workers do to either initiate or call for or start or do anything, advocate for more sustainable measures at the employee level? Em, how about
Sure.
going over on that screen?
Yeah, I'll hop in on this. If you're at a company like mine, which is large and has a parent that is overseas that dictates pretty much everything that we do, on the development side, it is difficult to get things moving. And really what you have to do is complain to one another. Like community does start with lunches and with, yammering about the things that you don't like about your workplace. And that was the case with Aegis CWA, with our union, and how we got started was very small groups, like one woman in particular, who I won't name her name just because she's asked me not to, but she got together a couple of groups of people and were like, hey, this really sucks in our workplace. We should unionize about it. And it starts with friendships. So when you are functioning inside of a structure that is so beyond your reach, where your voice basically does not matter in the grand scheme of things, you must do everything that you can to be as loud as possible to affect your immediate surroundings. So in our case, that meant getting together over lunches and games and whatnot, because of course we're going to game together. We're all in that community. Go over for movie nights and whatnot, and just start to really talk seriously about, hey, actually, we're being treated poorly. We're being underpaid massively. And there are things that we can do about it. It also takes a couple of people who are willing to do research, and finding people in your community who have different skill sets was massively important to us. And where we stand now, because, SEGA experienced a devastating swath of layoffs during our unionization process, and just recently too, we lost a couple of groups of people. But amidst all of that, we had to be very loud. Before that we had to be very quiet, because if anything got out first before we were ready, then they were very, very ready to try and quash our efforts. So in terms of instability, although in our contract, we won permanent positions for many people, and we were able to save some jobs and get severance packages for those that we weren't able to, help. There is still this lingering fear that they're going to keep cutting corners because, Parker and Eve, you were talking about this earlier. It is entirely about profits at a certain corporate level. And, we're numbers on a page. We're not people to the people who are making those decisions. It's entirely about pleasing shareholders, and less so about creating games that people love, which is, of course, our job on the development side. But, suits are going to have the final say on pretty much everything. So we just have to be very loud. So to your point, it is entirely about community and and talking to one another and getting upset about things we should be upset about. It's trepidation that holds us back. And it's especially when there's so much overhead that you just kind of can't pierce through.
No, thank you for that. And I think the community element is particularly important because, as we were seeing in our last conversation with Johanna and Jamie, I saw some folks in comments here and there feeling maybe a little like concerned, or like they don't want maybe to be the one voice that like speaks out, or the adversary against, the big company. And so really building that bridge with community sounds very empowering, but also extremely effective, because, as you said, having a loud voice, well, what's louder than a collective voice? So I really appreciate that input. So Autumn, I'm going to turn it to you now, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about your personal experiences on the union side, and what, I think we had a question just a little bit ago that I was kind of hoping we could touch on. What could unions do to help support or prevent layoffs in the grand scheme of things? Yeah, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, totally. So first of all, I just want to give mad props to M for the mention of community. I think that's number one, right? Like breaking down silos between different departments, different titles, like starting the conversation with each other again. And it's not just, not just complaining, and it's not just like talking to each other about what's wrong, but also talking to each other about what you want to protect, which is a lot of what this prevention is, right? It's protecting each other. It's like, how do we lessen the impacts? How do we lessen the burden of the worst thing imaginable that could possibly happen to us? And the way that we start that conversation is through building community, and, first in secrecy and then loudly, right? Honestly, so ZeniMax, we did have some layoffs. We have been impacted by the acquisition of Microsoft, and the wake of acquisitions, just the nature of how that is something we're certainly not a stranger to over the last couple of years. But no union members thus far have been impacted by that acquisition. So what that lesson has taught us is that just getting organized to begin with is a great start. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a strong tool in the tool chest that we've been able to tap into. And layoffs are a mandatory subject of bargaining, which means that a company has to negotiate with you in good faith over the terms and conditions of the impacts of things like layoffs. And I think for us, we've been really incredibly privileged and fortunate to not be directly impacted as union members by layoffs, but that doesn't mean that the impact itself to the rest of our coworkers hasn't been felt. We definitely emotionally, mentally in our teams, like we're all feeling that, right? So we have been leaning into the skill set of what it means to be game dev, right? We're getting creative, we're getting strategic, and we're talking about like, how do we mitigate these risks? So things like, I think long-term, there's certainly a strategy. Like, we're not going to change the industry overnight, but starting small with like, what about alternatives, right? Like, what if people could opt into like voluntary severance? What if there are people who say, you know what, yeah, I've been in this business for the last 10 years. I'm just like hitting some roadblocks here and there. I really want to go back to school and do something different. Like giving those people an opportunity to like lessen the impacts of layoffs that could be mandated on other people who don't want to leave. Like that's an alternative you could explore. Even like, let's say you are somebody directly impacted by a layoff, even putting things into a collective bargaining agreement that just helps to soften that blow, like extended COBRA benefits, things like notification, even like a longer notice to know like layoffs are coming, so that I'm not waking up and seeing an email that came in from my executive at 6 o'clock in the morning that says, hey, by the way, 1,900 jobs are lost. It'd be really cool to have that a couple months in advance. That's something that's really big for us, that we're definitely going to be locking into a CBA. And other things like even just having some assistance in where do I go from here? Like what's next? I could use somebody just showing me what's available out there. Show me like, where are the leads? Like, what should I be applying for? Just having somebody assist through that process is something that you can also explore in your collective bargaining agreements. And we're talking about it. We're trying to get creative, and yeah, we're thinking long-term, but we're also thinking like, what's useful right now? So
that's really awesome. Thank you. I see so much, again, going back to the theme of community, but also essentially communication among your peers, communication among your colleagues, but communication among the entire company. Because like you mentioned, if you can have a seat at the table to voice those ideas, those concerns, you can be a part of a sustainable solution. It just is a matter of getting that invitation and having that voice. Well, I wanted to ask you, just for folks who weren't familiar with the terminology of collective bargaining or collective bargaining agreement, Em or Autumn, do you want to take just like a minute to kind of explain, what that is, just in case anyone's new to unionization here?
So, Autumn, you may have a little bit to add to this after I'm done here. But our collective bargaining, the way that it worked for us was that it basically means anybody who is part of the union has a voice, and while that voice is channeled through a few people at the bargaining table, basically, you at least how it worked for us was we were a team of 5 plus 7 technically, plus our 2 union representatives, who gathered information from the rest of our unit. We pulled on like what issues were most important to them at the time, kind of ranked what we should bring to the table first and when. We sort of checked in with them and asked if there was anything that we were missing, that kind of thing. And pretty consistently along the way, we were bringing issues to the table. It's quite literally collectively all of our voices meeting with HR and bargaining back and forth. We have to hear their proposals and they have to hear ours. They are legally required to bargain in good faith. And we are as well. We signed an agreement at the beginning and everything, making sure okay, we're gonna try and meet each other at level. they reserve their right to function as a company, and we propose what we believe we deserve, and kind of come to an agreement where nobody is fully satisfied, but we both get things that we think that we need in the agreement. Autumn, if you have anything to add to that. Then.
Yeah, I think you covered all of the most important parts. The only thing that I would add is that, at least in our case, and I think this is true for you as well, your CBA or contract, it is not indefinite necessarily, so it does expire after a certain amount of time. So when I talk about long-term strategy, what I'm talking about is, like, let's say, for the sake of argument, you have a collective bargaining agreement or a contract, whatever you want to call it, it's the same thing. Let's say it expires in 2 years. Well, you meet again in 2 years to talk about the contract. You're doing retrospectives. What went well? What was not good? How do we iterate on this to make it better? So that would also be a factor.
Wonderful. No, thank you for the clarification. Again, contextualizing it in the sense of a conversation about needs, wants, expectations, but in this sense, it's legally supported. It's legally binding once it's a contract. It has, at least for folks in certain regions, you have a legal right to collectively organize. And so, yeah, that's really great. So I wanted to touch on something Autumn had mentioned a little bit ago about kind of the aspect of survivorship after mass layoffs. And that really, I think, probably touches a lot of people's hearts who are watching right now, because either they've been laid off, they have friends who laid off, people continuing at a place of employment had their friends laid off. Eve, I want to take this question to you because I know you've done a lot of work around this. How do layoffs impact us, like on the individual developer level? Whether that's the survivorship aspect of somebody who's still working when their friend's laid off, or somebody who's been laid off. I'd love to hear a little bit more on your take.
Man, layoffs are rough. They're really rough, and they're rough on everyone. I'll start with people who are laid off, because even though layoffs are not a decision based on the quality of work, they're based on a financial modeling process, or at least they're supposed to be. Layoffs, right? Layoffs impact people's sense of efficacy in their job. Like, oh, I was laid off. This is somehow a reflection of my ability to do this work. It can really mess with people's sense with people's self-confidence, with their sense of, like, I know how to do this work and I'm, worth doing it, especially people who've been in the industry long enough to have gone through multiple rounds of layoffs. It can feel really demoralizing, and really impact their ability to go back out and get another job, to feel like they're worthwhile, and that's really hard. And what I'll say about that is that it's not unexpected to feel that way, and remember that that's often just a reaction to the fact that this sucks. It's not about you. The people who stay, who did not get laid off, often deal with survivor's guilt, and a sense of, like, why did I get to stay and my colleagues and people I loved working with didn't get to stay? And it's important to leave time and space to really process that. One of the things that companies that do go through layoffs should do, and some do and some really don't, is to give people some quiet time, some recognition that, the few days, especially, and sometimes weeks after layoffs, are going to be emotionally taxing for the people left, and they need time to process and also reorganize work. Because the other impact on people who stay is that they get more work, and they often develop burnout and face additional levels of stress, et cetera. And so that's really hard on people, and that can snowball over time. It can become a long-term impact. And so that it becomes a responsibility of management to really watch for that and to keep an eye on it, and to think about, okay, if we're doing layoffs, what are we going to drop because there's fewer people to do the work? And that has to be a realistic expectation. And then finally, and this is one that doesn't often get talked about, but there are going to be managers and leaders who are impacted by this too. We often, there's often very kind of cut and dried and cold business decisions involved here. And there are some people who don't care that they're doing layoffs or feel like this is a good solution. But there are many people, especially people in middle management and folks who have a little less power or feel like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place in these decisions, who are also going to feel very bad about what they have to do. Especially in indie studios, that are like, listen, we don't have money, and suddenly either it's everybody loses their job or some people lose their job, and to give space for people who, and to yourself, if you're in that position of recognizing that that's going to be emotionally taxing and hard, and it's going to suck, and you need some time to lick your wounds, and so layoffs aren't good for anyone. In some.
Thank you for that, Eve. And so kind of, again, taking it back to the solutions and path forward, we've talked a little bit, again, I know we've stayed on the layoff topic a bit longer than I anticipated, but it's just really one of the biggest things impacting developers right now. So I think it's important to really humanize that experience for those who maybe have not been a part of it or who are in those decision-making capacities. And then, Autumn, I also wanted to give you space to, if you wanted to talk even a little bit more about, how you mentioned like that survivorship aspect of well, contextualizing some of Eve's comments about the big picture aspect of it.
Yeah. It is really hard to talk about. Layoffs suck. That's a really perfectly truncated way to put how it feels. It just sucks. It sucks really, really bad. It's incredibly disruptive, not only to the people directly impacted, but just all the teams, the projects, the business. There is definitely some survivor's guilt on my part. I can speak to my own experience, and I know that I also have spoken to a lot of other coworkers who feel similarly, especially being union and knowing that we have personally in my QA unit, we have survived 3 rounds of Microsoft layoffs and studio shutterings. And I personally was a part of working on Project Redfall, which was attached to Arcane Austin, and Arcane Austin was shut down. And knowing that there was some part of me that was like, okay, we put in the work, which was a lot of work to get organized so that we could have some shot at having protections in place. So like, I know in our own way, like we did what we had to do and we could, right? Like we put in the work, we were able to make it happen, but that doesn't help in the moment when you realize how many other people like also deserve those same things. They also deserve those protections. They also deserve to have a voice in these spaces because they are as much a part of making these incredible products and making these millions and billions of dollars as much as I am, as much as anybody is. So there's the measuring the two scales of like, I really put the work in, and like I to some degree, I guess I earned this, not being affected, but like at the same time, you shouldn't have to earn it. So like you should just not suffer, so it's a weird, like, it's not a good feeling, I guess. Yeah. It's complicated. And even being in ZeniMax and hearing Sega's story from afar when we were in our bargaining and hearing about Sega's bargaining and knowing that while you were in the midst of bargaining, you were also being impacted by layoffs. I cried, actually. I really cried about that. I'm not even in Sega, and I just could not imagine the emotional weight of having to put numbers on your own coworkers and having to figure out how you mitigate the impact. I quite literally cannot even fathom it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I can certainly sense the empathetic connection you have with your fellow developers. And I think that's something we need more as an industry, leadership with empathy and decision-making with empathy. And I think humanizing those experiences more, you can't leave this conversation and think layoffs don't have a significant impact, not just on a company, but on the industry itself, on the people who fuel it. Like you all, I really appreciate you sharing that story. I want to take the conversation. Oh, and also just to acknowledge some questions in the chat. We'll definitely get to questions here towards the end, and please feel free to post those questions and I'll star them and then we'll refer back to them. But kind of going back to the workload aspect after layoffs. So yes, layoffs, horrible aspect of our industry right now, but the lingering effects that we're seeing are tied to not necessarily only layoffs, but things that have existed for a while, like crunch and overworking, underpayment. I want to talk a little bit about work conditions and workers' rights and how we can frame potential paths forward and solutions regarding that. And you know what, I should start with Parker. I know the IGDA has done some recent surveys, statistics regarding crunch. Do you have any insight on those?
Yeah, I mean, hilariously, a lot of this comes out of the session we had just before this, because the DSS always covers crunch. And so, I mean, it is one of those things where it's not gone, and but with respect to the numbers, actually, the people being impacted with crunch, I'm seeing if I can pull them up really quickly here, but it's
no worries.
25% of the people that were in, there we go, I found them. 25% of the people that had been surveyed worked longer extended hours not classified as crunch, and then 28% said their job involved crunch. So that's 50% of the industry looking at something that's really heavy, and that's going to lead to burnout in the long run. It's not, and especially when you consider, when you take what we've been discussing, which is layoffs and then the residual work that gets placed on the survivors, it becomes a whole aspect of needing to reevaluate timelines and workloads and expectations, because it's just not realistic to be like, okay, cool, this is on your plate now, have fun. No. And so it's really a call to the people managers or the producers, like whoever is responsible for helping allocate the work, whoever has that power and ability to say, no, you are, you know what, we're going to put a pause on this thing for now, and being able to prioritize, because you have to. If not, you are going to destroy your current workforce. That is not sustainable for any company at all.
Great, thank you. And I think to the statistics that you mentioned, I think also like among the people who crunched, I want to say like over 63% or 65% crunched more than twice within the last 2 years. So not only has like crunch not really gone away, maybe it's reduced on a grand scale a little bit, but the rate of crunch of people who do crunch has increased, especially over the last few years.
Yeah,
I know that during the pandemic, people were at home, oftentimes feeling like the need to work, constantly overworking.
Balancing things. They also had to balance because parents, they had their kids home that they're suddenly expected to educate them as well, Jerry. He's like, I know this. Mm-hmm. So they're doing multiple jobs on top of their day-to-day job, because they can't take them to daycare. They don't have somebody to watch them. They don't have, they're even like taking care of your parents if there's elderly or sick involved. There's so many people that we have depending on our individual lives that compounded the pressure. So it's not even just if you look at like the work within your work, it is actually looking at it as a holistic picture and what is impacting each of the individuals, which is really why the reprioritization of what's getting done and the reevaluation of the timing and the time frames and whatnot is so key and important, because otherwise,
Could I jump in?
I was actually going to pass it right to you.
All right. Great, good. I want to say something. I think, we were seeing prior to this last DSS, we had been seeing declining rates of crunch. And I differentiate, there's two ways I talk about crunch. There's like last minute, oh shit, the game's about to release and we found a bug kind of crunch, the last 4 to 6 weeks before delivery. And then there's cultural crunch, which is long term. We're going to always work too much, which is really the most harmful thing, right? And it really is a failure of planning and scoping, and hiring, right? And it makes a lot of sense that with layoffs and with the current structural problems in the industry, we're going to see an increase in that, and that's really harmful because it burns people out. And I'm leaving my job because of burnout right now, and that is burnout is really fundamentally bad for people, and it also results in much worse delivery of product, right? You don't get good work out of people when they work too much and they they can't produce. And so and there's lots of documentation, like more work does not equal better product. It equals worse product. So what we are doing is actively harming the workforce that you want, and then you're losing people who have institutional knowledge and experience and context for what should be, what makes good games and how to make good games. And you're also probably delivering worse games, right? And that's
so bring down sales and then lead to a lot of the other capitalist issues and viral effect there.
Yeah, it's not good in the long term. In the short term, it solves some balance sheet issues. In the long term, it probably harms the industry. Yeah. What is encouraging to me are these other models of production and ownership and funding and smaller studios of people who have been in the industry a while, know how to make good games, and are trying to build other models and better studio environments at the indie level. And I really, that's always where the most interesting and most exciting stuff has happened. And indie studio culture and the focus on culture in indie studios has really, really transformed over the time that I've been at Take This. And I really find encouragement there. As long as people there, those get good funding, funding that is sufficient, but also not the kind of venture funding that, expects massive, quick, instantaneous returns. And also as long as those funding models and those studios are run by a diverse range of people who care about the folks around them. So this is also my plea to people who do funding, to make sure that you're funding diverse founders. Like, I can't emphasize enough how important this is, because the more diversity among founders, the better and healthier an ecosystem and the better kinds of games you're going to get. And then you're going to start to see real transformation of culture. And so, I think unionization, especially at the large corporate level, is a really important bulwark, as Adam and Em have talked about. And then at the smaller level, it's about funding really, really diverse types and kinds of people and types and kinds of founders.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Eve, for that.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate your take on it, and especially with like Parker considering the personal aspects of how crunch, overworking impacts our lives, especially when we have responsibilities outside work, as we all do, but really also taking it back to the structural and the industry at large. And that makes me want to go to, of course, Adam and Em, to have a little bit further conversation about crunch and burnout and the role that unions may play in supporting developers, in protecting developers, in carving a path where we don't have to deal with that. That's not a regular cultural element of our workplace. Adam, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. Well, like we've been saying, a common theme is communication. I do think that's definitely a part of it. Just communicating in general, like being better about communicating the scope of work, being better about communicating the need for more hands to make less work, but also communicating at a negotiating table, communicating at the table that says, there has to be a cap to this. There has to be maybe God, there's so many different ways to solve this. So many different ways to solve this. Something we've tried, actually. I can talk about something that has happened and has worked for us. Something we've tried is mandating that people must that the company must seek volunteers before forcing people into the work, before forcing people to take on more than 40 hours. It works. No one's been mandated into crunch so far in QA since we've started that policy, and it's been working. Also doing things like making it worth it, making it so that if you are having to do this extra work, make it expensive for the business so that they have to really reconsider, okay, maybe we don't want to do crunch because it's costing us time and a half, it's costing us double every single time we have these teams going into crunch. Which, I mean, I don't know. There's so many ways to tackle it. This goes back into the leaning into the skill set of game devs and into the creativity and how to strategically sort of solve these issues. But I'd be curious to know what Em thinks.
That is, see, this is all uncharted territory for us since Aegis is such a new union, and large companies like Sega, we've been plagued by crunch that we don't have much control over since the inception, basically, of this industry, and we're seeing it right now. This is on a personal level. My project is in crunch and has been for some time, but the problem is, even though we are working at as like quickly, efficiently, and as with as high quality as we can at this pace, we are still being given text to translate and localize at this point, even though we are quite literally days away from a deadline where we are no longer able to, where we have to have text locked in. So, and that's part of the process when you're trying to attain what we call simship, which is, for anybody who does not know that term, that is when a game that is being released in Japan is released in English-speaking and non-Japanese speaking countries at the same time. So basically, the translation is happening at the same time that development is happening. And occasionally, we'll get text changes in Japanese and we have to redo a bunch of work. And then it's this endless cycle of, they have their deadlines that they're working with, and we have ours that have a little bit more punch to them because there's more work to do on our end. And there is a lack of communication because we do our jobs very well. And they kind of expect that to happen because we put out high quality work, and they're like, okay, they can get it done. And there's no communication between, there's not enough communication between our parent company's development side and our development side, where they're not hearing, hey, we're getting sick and we experience massive layoffs. We don't have enough hands, and we're having to pull people from other projects in order to get this done in this amount of time that you are giving us. We are still siloed from the ears that need to hear our complaints and our joys as well, because we love the project and we want it to go smoothly. And in order for this game to come out on time, we need to be healthy and well equipped with the resources that we need, that we just don't have right now. So the one of the biggest issues with this kind of crunch is that it's so preventable if they would just agree to delay the game by a couple of weeks or something like that. But they promise a release date before the game is finished. Because they project that it will, come out at this time, and they're projecting sales and all that before anything is actually done and set in stone. And again, it is about sales, and it's about timing its release in comparison to other studios when their games are going to come out. You got to slot it right in so that you can get as much media coverage as possible, as much attention as possible on your title, so that it will sell well. And that affects us entirely. We are so short-staffed right now, especially in the QA department. We have multiple people who are working 10 to 12-hour days on the regular, just to get a couple of titles pushed out, because the company they've shot themselves in the foot with all these layoffs, because they want to cut corners to save money and to make more, because we have record profits, but we don't have enough to pay an extra 20 workers to make these projects go more smoothly. And it is deeply frustrating, and it is still uncharted territory. We do not know at the moment how exactly we're going to proceed with this. We could complain perhaps to HR if we, petition people and say, hey, we really need more communication with JP. Can we please have that? That is something that we can do. We have a grievance process that is in our contract that we're so excited that we won. But beyond that, we may have to wait until our contract is up to really solidify some things. So while it's uncharted territory, there are options. It's just it's scary right now.
Oh my goodness. I really hope that you yourself and your team are okay, and you take some time for yourself after the working hours when you can. I'm so sorry you're having to deal with that. But that really just shows the impact and the collapse of an industry. We cannot survive on our workers working 10, 12-hour days constantly, overworking them, burning them out. And to everyone's point, conversations, communication, better leadership, better decision-making and planning, being creative in the brainstorming process of how to navigate the murky waters. And then, of course, funding diverse founders. All of these are really potential ways of moving forward. Unionization, of course, as you all have mentioned, and its support in voicing your concerns. You mentioned having a grievance process put in place in your collective bargaining agreement. First of all, that's amazing. I'm so happy to hear that. On the flip side, it irks me that has to be something that is collectively bargained. Like, that should just be a thing. And I think you've all shown just how complex and intermingled a lot of these issues that the industry is facing. And as I mentioned in the opening today, I want this to be a conversation starter, definitely not a conversation where we end and we have the solutions and all things are great tomorrow, because that's not the reality. I wanted this to be a very candid conversation. So I really appreciate the honesty and the transparency here. Due to time, I had two other sections I wanted to hit, which included employee and employer relations and diversity, equity, inclusion. However, it's great to say that the next session in our summit is a breakout session, one for anyone who's interested in organizing a union at their workplace. And then the other session is advocacy in games, where actually both of those topics will be pretty much covered in depth. And so with that said, we do have some additional questions that I don't think we're going to be able to answer. However, if you wanted to say, one last thing for today's panel before we jump off to our breakout sessions, I wanted to give each of you an opportunity. Parker, we'll start with you and we'll go in order.
Why did you have to start with me? No, I think the main thing I've been that I think summarizes a lot of the conversations we had in a lot of ways is leverage your community. I know even when you're starting out, I know you're building your community, but don't be afraid to reach out and reach out, whether it's to IGDA, whether it's to Take This, whether it's to other nonprofit organizations within the gaming space. There are a lot of them, and they're really great ways to get involved and to build that community, so you have people you can talk to ask these questions of, hey, yeah, I want to start a union. Oh, well, now I know Em and Autumn. I'm going to go talk to them about this. Like, it's expanding your network, expanding your community, because that becomes both a safety net for if you get laid off or if you survive a mass layoff. That becomes so much of everything of how you can be able to move forward in this. I don't know. I'm a big believer in community helps everything move forward.
Yeah,
that's all.
I would Parker, I would say the same thing. I think from a mental health perspective, being in community with others is actually one of the most important protective factors there is. So having your people and finding them, and there are tons of communities online in games. Take This has a Discord that's like one of the coziest places in the world. It's really sweet. It's small by choice, and those spaces are. It's not necessarily that those are the places where you then have to go decide to organize and put in the amazing amount of effort that Em and Autumn have described. Take care of yourself so that you're well, because when you're well and you feel supported personally, you can do all kinds of things that you didn't know you could. And so making sure that you are in community first and supported and well yourself is the first step in all of this. Take care of yourself, and then you can go do amazing things.
Thank you, Eve.
Yeah.
Em, how about you? Any last words?
Mostly just going to echo Parker and Eve and say, make friends at work, talk to people. Again, the community aspect, cannot stress enough how important that is. And get to know your coworkers' skill sets as well. Figure out what people are comfortable with, figure out who's willing to sort of push the boundaries of their comfort zones in terms of like doing research, reaching out to other to potential unions that you could organize with. Who's good at compiling resources. That's a huge part of all of this. And also share your joys. Please share your joys. That's going to keep you going throughout all of this. This is a passion industry, and it's not called that for nothing. But yeah, commiserate, but also please keep your eye towards the sun in this case. Like there are good things ahead, and you have to hold on to hope.
Thank you, Em. And when you mentioned the sharing your excitements and joys with like leadership in the team earlier, that I thought that was really awesome, and I think more joy can be shared for sure. Autumn, how about you?
It's a perfect segue into what I was going to say. Don't lose hope. Yeah. It's corny, right? But don't lose hope. You celebrate your wins, celebrate your victories, and also do your research, right? We are living in an era of just infinite information at your fingertips, really. And there are so many resources. It can be a little hard to sift through sometimes. It's not always really accessible, but there are people right here, even in this space, just ready and waiting to help and to be a part of the conversation and to help you, to teach you how to build community, if that's what you're looking for, and how to break down those silos in the workplace and how to celebrate those wins and to fight for those wins. And people do it every day. Every single day people do it. So yeah, don't give up. Don't lose hope.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for, again, the transparency, the candid conversation, the authenticity here. I know we talked a lot about heavy things, so I hope when you leave today's conversation, you have some time for yourself to rejuvenate. I really appreciate you going deep with me here, especially for those tuning in. And y'all are just amazing people, and you're doing amazing work for our industry. So thank you with all my gratitude. With that said, we will now move on to our final segment of today's Changing the Industry Summit, where we'll break out into sessions, one for advocacy and games and one for union organizing. I put the links in chat, so please feel free to join us on Discord now, because these will be more interactive, and we hope to see you there. All right, everyone, thank you so much, and have a great day. Hope to see you at the Advocacy and Games or the Union Organizing panel.